On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, starting the Second World War. First, let's take a closer look at how both sides planned and prepared for the conflict, from soldiers, material, and even the terrain. The Wehrmacht needed to take Poland quickly because a long invasion could possibly mean a two-front war, the same situation that aided in Germany's defeat in World War I. The German plan was standard for Blitzkrieg: break through the enemy's defenses, encircle their forces into cauldrons, eliminate those cauldrons, and then repeat the process until the campaign was over. Speed was the essential component for the invasion, and it would be in the form of tanks and armored vehicles. Geographically, Poland was well suited for Blitzkrieg, since the country had flat plains and all the mountains were located further south. So as long as the weather cooperated, the German army had few natural obstacles to overcome. There were rivers like the Vistula and Oder, but the summer heat had dried them up. Defensive fortifications were being built by the Poles, but those were incomplete by the time of the invasion. In addition, Poland was quite literally in a bad position. The Germans could attack from multiple places, either on the border, East Prussia, the annexed Czech lands, and the puppet state of Slovakia. Also, the Poles had poor relations with Russia, nor were they that great with Lithuania, and Hungary and Romania wouldn't dare go against Germany militarily. Prior to the invasion, Germany launched several false flag attacks like the Gleiwitz incident as a pretext to invade. German SS or SD in Polish uniforms attacked various places on the Polish-German border. They scared the locals, fired a few inaccurate shots, committed acts of vandalism, and left behind dead concentration camp prisoners in uniform. Though originally planned on August 26th, it was pushed back. However, one of the units wasn't informed, so they carried out an attack on a customs post, killing several Germans. On top of all this, the German propaganda machine produced supposedly true stories about ethnic Germans being killed in Poland. These types of messages were broadcasted on the radio and written in the newspapers throughout the entire summer. So much so that many people in Germany actually believed they were true and that the invasion was to protect them. So right from the start, before that actually, Germany went to war based on lies. As German soldiers and panzers massed along the border, the Poles wanted to mobilize their forces as well, but the Anglo-French governments rejected this, saying that there was no provocation. But by August 30th, Marshal of Poland Eduard Ritz-Smigel ordered a general mobilization. Poland had prepared for a possible war, but most of that focus had been towards the east with the Soviet Union. And there was a big disagreement about how to defend against the German invasion. Should they defend along the border or pull back to the major rivers? The latter is more strategically sound because it would shorten the front, the supply lines, and make coordination easier. However, much of Poland's industry and natural resources lay in the west, and many didn't want to just give up all that land without a fight, including Marshal Ritz. So Plan Zachod, or Plan West, was formed. This strategy called for holding back the Germans at the border regions before retiring to the rivers and waiting for the Allies to launch an offensive into Germany. But critics like Václav Stachewicz saw the flaws in this plan. First, it would make the Polish army vulnerable to encirclement, and second, it relied heavily on the British and French coming to Poland's aid. For the invasion, the German army had about 1.5 million soldiers along with 2,750 tanks organized into 6 panzer divisions. Most were Panzer Is and IIs, but they still had the Panzer III and about 211 Panzer IVs, as well as the Panzer 38T of Czech origin. For the operation, the Germans would have over 2,300 aircraft, and the Luftwaffe also participated in the Spanish Civil War, making it the best trained, best equipped, and most experienced air force in the world at that time. At sea, the Germans had 4 battleships, 11 cruisers, 21 destroyers, and 57 U-boats. The Germans would also be helped with 3 divisions of the Slovak army, numbering around 50,000 men, with some light artillery, but no tanks. The Poles, for their part, called up 500,000 men, and during their campaign, they would call up another 500,000. While many of these soldiers were greatly motivated and had proper training, the Polish army lacked sufficient equipment like field wireless sets and motorized vehicles. The Poles did have a large amount of cavalry, though not armed with sabers, but rather with rifles, machine guns, and even anti-tank guns. Though I would like to point out that the Germans also had a large amount of horses in use. For armor, the Poles had the 7 TP tank, which was capable of taking out the Panzer IV, but only 149 of these were made by this time. A more common vehicle was the TKS Tankette. These were usually armed with machine guns, so they functioned more like armored cars and were no match against anything except the Panzer I. In addition, the Poles had purchased 88 tanks from the British and French, 50 Renault R35s, and 38 Vickers. The Poles also had 10 armored trains outfitted with artillery and heavy machine guns. In the skies, Poland had less than 400 modern planes. The P-24 was the latest fighter, but it was outclassed by the German models. Also, many P-24s were sold to other countries, so they had to rely primarily on the older P-11. The bomber force was more modern, but not all of the aircraft were mobilized. For instance, of the 120 PZL-37 heavy bombers produced, only 36 were combat ready. The Polish Navy was small with just 4 destroyers, 5 submarines, and various smaller vessels. However, the Poles enacted the Peking Plan, in which the destroyers Burza, Grom, and Błyskawica, Storm, Thunder, and Lightning, were evacuated to Edinburgh. The submarines would then mine the Polish coast around Danzig, today Gdansk, and harass enemy ships. On the 1st of September 1939 at 4:45 a.m. on the Baltic Sea, the aging German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish military depot at Westerplatte. Even before that, German soldiers were already crossing the border. The Luftwaffe then began attacking both military and civilian targets. In fact, the first large-scale bombing occurred at Wielun. The invasion of Poland had begun. One of the first clashes occurred at the village of Mokra, beginning the Battle of the Border. There, the Poles were able to blunt a German attack thanks to the Polish cavalry and the armored train Śmiały. The next couple of days saw mixed success for both sides as the Germans advanced but took some heavy casualties in both men and material. Fighting even occurred on German soil when Polish units launched a raid on Fraustadt. While the Germans suffered some heavy losses, their advance as a whole hadn't slowed, and the Poles kept losing ground. The Polish armies were then ordered to retreat to the Vistula and Dunajec rivers, but as mentioned before, the rivers had dried up, making them less of an obstacle. To make the situation even worse, fleeing refugees clogged the roads, foiling Polish efforts to contain the German breakthrough. There was hope when the British and French not only declared war on Germany, but also launched an offensive into the Saar. But this was just a pipe dream as a phony war settled in. In the air, despite being outnumbered and outmatched, Polish pilots downed many enemy aircraft and initially showed the same respect and courtesy pilots in World War I had. Though this quickly changed once the Poles found out about the bombing and strafing attacks on civilians as well as downed Polish pilots. Side note, the Poles actually had an opportunity to deliver a serious blow to the Germans when Polish planes spotted a large column of German troops and vehicles, but the lack of bombers prevented this from being exploited. Back on the ground, the situation was going from bad to worse. The Germans were able to reach the Vistula by September 3rd, and 2 days later captured Lutz. The Poles did contain a German thrust to Warsaw and captured a bunch of panzers, but had to abandon the Polish corridor, Upper Silesia, and Greater Poland. And by the 8th, German forces had reached the outskirts of the Polish capital. North of Warsaw, the Germans were able to overcome the Polish defenses and using their momentum prevented the Poles from creating a new defensive line. Soon after that, Polish forces were ordered to the Romanian bridgehead, but not all units followed this order and instead went to Warsaw to help with the defense of the capital. On the 9th, Poland launched a massive counterattack west of Warsaw along the Bzura River. Despite initial success, the Germans realized this threat and used their air superiority to make moving around during the day suicidal for the Polish forces. The Germans then attacked from all sides after the Poles dug in on the northern bank of the river. The Polish forces then attempted to break out to Warsaw, but in the process had to abandon a lot of heavy equipment. After 2 days of heavy fighting, with no ammunition and no food remaining, further attempts at a breakout for the Poles became impossible. While some units did manage to get to Warsaw, the majority were captured. Back at Warsaw, German ground attacks were repulsed and suffered heavy casualties. For instance, the 4th Panzer Division lost 80 of their 220 tanks. At the same time, German units had to be pulled from taking Warsaw to instead deal with the Polish counterattack. So while the Battle of the Bzura was a failure for the Poles, it did succeed in buying time for the Warsaw garrison to reorganize and build up the city's defenses. In the meantime, the Germans surrounded the city, but it took until the 15th before this was completed, and even by then, the Wehrmacht was still fighting at the Bzura and at the Modlin fortress. The Luftwaffe had been bombing Warsaw with increasing intensity since by September 6th, heavy losses in the Polish Air Force meant that the air defense of the city was left to just the AA units. On the 25th of September came the largest air raid when Luftwaffe bombers flew over 1,100 sorties dropping explosive and incendiary bombs. This is known as Black Monday. The bombing of the city had mixed success. While it lowered the defenders' morale, it didn't convince them to surrender. After Black Monday, the Germans attacked on all fronts and captured 3 crucial forts. While all this was going on, the situation further deteriorated for Poland. Not only had the Allies failed to provide any meaningful support, but a new enemy arrived. On the 17th of September began the Soviet invasion of Poland. There were defenses in the east against an invasion, but much of Poland's manpower was busy fighting the Germans. Many of the men in the east were actually undergoing rush training, so the only real threat to the Russians was the Polish Border Protection Corps. Meanwhile, the Russians assembled a massive force of at least 600,000 men with nearly 5,000 guns, 4,700 tanks, and 3,300 aircraft. The excuse the Russians gave was that they were protecting Ukrainian and Belarusians living in Poland, but in reality this was not true. Initially, the soldiers at the border were ordered to welcome the Russians, thinking they had come to their aid to fight the Germans. These hopes vanished as Soviet and Polish troops fired at each other and Russia's intentions were made clear. The Poles engaged the Soviets in a series of small clashes in places like Grodno, Lvov, now Lviv, and Vilno, modern-day Vilnius. Despite the disadvantages the Poles had, they managed to have some success in the Battle of Shatsk and in the Lublin province. With two invasions in full swing and no imminent Western aid, the Polish leaders realized that the Battle of Poland was lost, but not the war, so the government ordered all Polish units to essentially get the hell out of Poland and head for France. The Polish army continued fighting with the largest tank battle of the campaign occurring at Tomaszu Lubelski. Fighting at Warsaw continued until its surrender on the 28th of September, with the fortress of Modlin following on the 29th. At the accurately named Hel Peninsula, the Poles managed to hold out from the start of the invasion until October 2nd. The last major battle of the campaign occurred near the town of Kotsk, which lasted until October 5th, after which the last Polish units surrendered, thus ending the September campaign. I mentioned before that Polish soldiers were ordered to get out of Poland to continue the fight abroad in the hope of liberating the country from Nazi and Soviet tyranny. Well, the Navy was able to achieve this quickly and was pressed into Allied service. The Polish Air Force flew into neighboring countries like Hungary and Romania, flying out planes, personnel, equipment, and aviation fuel. LOT Airlines even flew out all their planes as well as their machine tools and heavy equipment. The planes and equipment that landed into Hungary and Romania were then seized by their respective militaries, but they were out of the hands of the Nazis. The Polish army had a tougher time. For one thing, they had to get to France from Central Europe while avoiding German and Soviet territory. In Romania, the government was pressured by the Nazis to follow international law, but many officials were pretty well disposed towards the refugees. There was the complication that in order to leave Romania, they would need a passport, so the Polish embassy worked overtime, even to the point where one worker was doing their job perfectly while sleeping. The Hungarians were more friendly towards the Poles, allowing many to just cross over. Overall, 100,000 Polish soldiers and civilians fled to Hungary. 30,000 more soldiers and airmen escaped to Lithuania and Latvia, where they were interned before making their way into Finland. The Poles that wanted to go fight went towards places like Yugoslavia and even across the Black Sea, with their final destination being France. Even though the Germans won the battle, it took longer than anticipated. It would have taken even longer had the Poles implemented a better defense plan and had not been invaded by the USSR. A major factor in the Polish defeat was also the lack of an Allied response. Most of the German military was focused on Poland, leaving their western border vulnerable, but the Allies did not attack. Still, fighting was so fierce that the German commanders told Hitler that they needed time to recover from the losses before invading France. For the casualties, check out my earlier videos on just that. After the invasion was over, Poland was split up, primarily between Germany and Russia, with Slovakia and Lithuania gaining territory as well. While Poland did fall, and many Poles did surrender, the Polish government never entered into any sort of negotiations with the invaders. So while the campaign in Poland was over, the war was not. Polish soldiers would continue fighting at sea, in North Africa, and the European theater until the end of the war, only to be betrayed by the Western powers once victory was achieved. Thank you for watching, and if you want to learn about another invasion, check out my earlier video on Germany's invasion of Belgium in 1914. Like, comment, and hit subscribe.